Thank you so very much, Meldan. Really loved hearing you represent the work that you had shared at the LCSW New York City conference to the Quadus meeting today. Thank you. Our next speaker is Andrew Pari. Andrew will be speaking about somatic re-experiencing of sexual trauma. Andrew, it's all yours.
And good morning, everyone. I'm gonna share my screen. Oh, I saw it just a moment ago. Where did it go? Ah, there it is. Okay, no sound or video, so it should be fine. Hopefully everyone can see that.
Yes, we can see it just fine. Thank you.
Okay, and is it large enough? Quick statement before I launch into this. I don't think this is a group that necessarily needs trigger warnings. I am going to be talking about sexual assault and rape, but not in any kind of a graphic sense. But one thing I do want to say, often when I give talks around this, I'm contacted afterwards, often by people who are wanting to work with me. And so I just want to put that out there that, please feel free to do that. That's perfectly okay. Sometimes people saying like, oh, I didn't want to bother you, or I didn't know if it was okay to do this, whether it's a public group or a professional group. So I just do want to put that out there that yes, it's perfectly okay to ask questions, contact me, or if you have some interest in working with me around these issues. Let's see. There we go. This is probably not a crowd I need to say this with, but I often talk about how I work to bridge what for me has been a very conservative world of sexual assault recovery, and that is my area. I'm a clinician more so than a researcher. And I've been in this field for about 30 years. I do sexual assault recovery primarily with women or female-bodied people around rape, sexual assault, child sexual abuse, incest, etc. And I have found that for some of the things that I've talked about over the years, within that framework, they are considered very taboo or controversial. In the kink BDSM world, they seem to be fairly well understood. As an example, one of the things that I become more nationally known for was talking about the experience for a lot of victims of having arousal or orgasm during rape or sexual assault. And when I would try and speak about this in kind of the more sexual recovery realms, there'd be a lot more raised eyebrows and what are you talking about, or accusations that I was asserting something, whereas when I would talk to either victim groups or kink groups, there would be like nodding heads and yes, of course. So a lot of my work has been about kind of bridging these two worlds, which I think everyone in this room is invested in. But these are not the usual crowds I'm talking to. So I came to this work and this research a number of years ago when I worked with this client. And short story is a young woman who had gotten severely injured after, not severely, she had gotten injured after going out quite a number of times to deliberately get herself raped. At least that was her description of it. Where she would dress a certain way, go to certain areas that she knew were unsafe, bars or nightclubs, or certain areas of the city that she lived in, and did this dozens of times over a several-month period until she confessed tearfully to a nurse when she had gotten injured what she was doing. And they said, honey, you need some help. And we worked together for a while. And it wasn't that I was completely unaware that there were survivors and victims who engaged in these practices, certainly in terms of CNC and that kind of thing. But to have someone do something to this extent, this dangerously, and this harmfully, self-harmfully, and in a large regard, non-consensually, and that's often an issue that comes up. I'll sometimes just do piece analysis of just this one case, and people will raise, well, what about the men that did this? They weren't consenting, or they didn't know about this. Those kinds of issues come up. But it kind of set me off on a journey to say, well, if this is happening here, there's other people who are doing this. And I began investigating online communities where people were actively engaged in these kinds of behaviors, both BDSM groups and talking about CNC, but then also kind of these more, what I would say, extreme methods. And I began interviewing women and started doing presentations on this. And I'll show a slide on that in just a moment. And the range of expression that I was seeing went anything from kind of the very common, masturbation fantasy, either maybe reading stories. I don't know how many people remember Nancy Friday from way back in the 70s, but some of the stories in her book were around sexual assault fantasy, rape fantasy, which I won't go into a whole thing about that. That's just a very well-known area. But in the range of expression I was seeing, it went all the way through CNC and then into this, what they were calling rape baiting, this intentional risk-taking, and in many cases, in my view as a therapist, unconscious risk-taking, meaning they weren't connecting what they were doing to their history. And that was the most concerning for me. And what I found in conducting these interviews was that, along with what I consider to be this dangerousness, that they were all, many of them, I should say, were reporting a reduction in their trauma symptoms, that their anxiety, their depression, their self-harming in other ways, whether it was CNC or this kind of more extreme form. And I started thinking, so this was a poster I presented at one of the, at a Caris Emote conference a few years ago. And I started thinking about this idea of what if there was a guided aspect to this? What if there was a therapeutic aspect to this? And I talked to many of the interviewees and provided some psychoeducation and kind of tied some pieces together that they were giving me. And as I did so, I realized that they were reporting back to me that they were experiencing, much greater insight and understanding, and a greater relief in that and understanding why they were doing these things, but also the shaping of their interest in how they did this changed. So I started thinking towards this idea of what at that point I was calling a therapeutic rape, because what they were saying was like this was highly engaging to them, and anyone who's familiar with kink research, kink work, this is going to make a lot of sense to them. And in the sexual assault world, we have prolonged exposure therapy, we have cognitive processing, and all of these things. And in prolonged exposure therapy, there's no question of people when there is a trauma that is not a sexual trauma, let's say a car accident, of working with people to be able to get behind the wheel again, to start driving again, to start doing these things again. And yet that isn't really touched in the sexual assault world. So I started kind of putting these pieces together. I won't say too much about repetition compulsion, but basically this drive to re-experience their trauma over and over and over and over again stems from repetition compulsion, which is a human defense mechanism. We all do this in different ways with different things, repeating experiences we had before, whether it was early life attachments or relationships, etc. But in this case, repeating these aspects of a traumatic event or putting themselves in situations, either in relationships or dating or specifically seeking this out. And then pairing that with what I was seeing as this very high elevated sympathetic nervous system response, that because they had been through this trauma, that their SNS had been sort of reset at this high idle state, which then for them required high impact experiences in order to paradoxically feel relaxed. And so for those of you who are clinicians who have worked with people like this, then you'll know these are the people who, if there's an emergency going on, they're right on it. They know exactly what to do. These people make excellent first responders. But in kind of the day-to-day drudgery of life, they tend to fall apart. The idea of doing laundry or kind of mundane tasks, and started looking at these pieces and putting them together. And The concept of repetition compulsion is to take us towards mastery. That is the idea of it. But when we're locked in that repetition, we never find it. So I started exploring this idea of bringing in the psychoeducation, the guided experience to the experiences these women were reporting to me, to help them move towards mastery or re-scripting. And so just briefly, re-traumatization is when things stay in that sub or unconscious place and cycle around and around and around, doesn't really move on from there. In mastery, it begins with the conscious connection of what they've been through to what they're doing, which can then move to an assimilation or an understanding of why they're doing that, an integration and acceptance, a reducing shame, or reducing the fears and the doubts of why they're doing that, and then ultimately healing, and then seeing this more as a positive expression of an original hurt rather than I'm broken, I'm worthless, and this is all I'm worth. And then we see that reduce symptomology, increase self-esteem, et cetera, et cetera. And then they re-script that. So then using kink in this way and moving it from kind of the more harmful to a less harmful way of doing this and a harm reduction strategy, using that kink expression and that re-experience to seek that mastery, to move from the subconscious, unconscious to the conscious, to move from just that memory to the assimilation, integration, and healing is the idea here. And when we change our story, we then can change our neural pathways and change our relationship with ourselves, ultimately. And again, what I saw missing in talking to these people and participating in a lot of online discussions was this more the therapeutic aspect. Where was the kind of neutral party to help them understand, make sense of, and guide and move them through this? That's what was missing. So it led me to the creation of what I'm calling somatic mastery of sexual trauma. And if someone has a better name for that, I keep kind of cycling through different names for this. But it's basically a blending of prolonged exposure therapy and a number of other things. And as one client told me, to them, it felt like EMDR on crack. And this was someone who had been through trauma therapy, had been through MDR, just found that it didn't quite get to what they were wanting to do. So I developed this idea, and it's still very much in the kind of, I'm moving the theoretical to application stage. But basically involves an initial interview and then an interview on the actual trauma experience, discussion of the model, identification of what I call trauma moments or trauma points. What are these kind of high impact elements of what they went through? Is it an image? Is it a sound? Is it a position they were held in? Is it a feeling on their body? Like where do those trauma moments live within them? And being able to then talk about how do we incorporate that into creation of the scene. And then safety skills teaching. I do a lot of grounding work, a lot of safety skills, a lot of self-monitoring work before engaging in any of this. So a person knows how to both ground themselves, and then if we're bringing in a partner, how the partner can help do that too. And then we get into what this role play would look like. What does this enactment look like? What elements do they want it to have? What do they don't? And it really goes the range. Some of them have no sexual involvement whatsoever. It may just be reenactment of a memory of what someone said, or it may go through a full reenactment of what they went through or elements thereof. Obviously, there's aftercare design, not just for the client, but also for the partner, perpetrator, player, but certainly looking at that. And then the enactment itself, I as a therapist do not participate in that. I'm aware that it's happening. I'm available if the client needs to talk, but we do have a session set up to do therapeutic processing around that. And that piece can take multiple sessions. That's not a one session thing. Because there's a lot usually to explore, to go through, to help them understand, in a sense, similar to those of you who practice EMDR. And then there is the processing that occurs, in the weeks after that. And then from that point, there is a re-review of trauma points. Did we address what we were looking to address? Are there maybe secondary points that we weren't looking to address, but that have now emerged as something that we want to re-explore and then go back through designing an enactment? So that's what the model looks like. I realize this is kind of a wall of text, so I'll kind of let you read through some of these and I'll just sort of pick out a couple. But basically, for most of the clients that I've worked with and more so the people that I've interviewed, it was connecting the understanding of what they've been through to doing this experience and emerging from this whole, whereas they did not feel in their original non-consensual sense that they had. And that's kind of the, one of the key elements is the non-consent versus the consent, whether they are designing a full role play with a partner, or in Katie's case, kind of going out and doing this in a much more dangerous way. There's still the sense for them that they are in control of what they are doing. And then for them, there is a therapeutic healing piece to that. Connecting that emotional state to physically re-experiencing what they've went through is another piece that comes out on, I don't know if it's the next slide. Yes, wanted to share some of the quotes from some of the people I talked to, that if I'm feeling vulnerable or the weight of my history, engaging in this helps me feel in control and more at peace. Therapy helped alleviate the shame, but it didn't come undone. That having this kind of somatic intensity, power exchange and force was what helped move them past that. Someone who wanted to explore CNC because they had read somewhere that it could be a good way of overcoming what had happened to them. And probably most impacting to me was one of the interview subjects who said this: I felt like the fact that I had been raped before was suddenly not a big deal anymore. And when we talk in terms of trauma and the work of trauma recovery, this is what we want. We want someone to say, this awful thing that happened to me no longer lives in my present. I didn't forget it. I didn't ignore it, but it now lives in my past as something that doesn't haunt my present. And that is the goal of moving towards this in this way. So that's my talk. Open to any questions. I realize that I ran through a lot of stuff. Typically, I take a couple of hours to go through this. So if I gave short work to anything, then feel free to ask questions or at the end. And thank you to Frederick. Thank you to the Kink, SIG, and Quadis for allowing me to present this work once again.
Andrew, thank you.
Sharing.
Andrew, thank you so very much for presenting everything you just did. I found the work to be very informative, very thought-provoking for myself. We had probably close to a dozen questions in the chat, plus many, many thoughts in many directions as far as yippee-ki-yays or oh my goodnesses in the chat as well. But
no one who wants to excoriate me yet. That's more the reaction that I anticipate.
I will make no comment in either direction on that one.
All right.
But I do want to be respectful of people's overall time around the planet. And so hopefully, I don't know if Andrew will be able to stay a little longer today, but there were many questions I would love for people to be able to ask. But I want to be able to move to Vanessa, Lexi, and Courtney's presentation on Kink cultural competency scale.
I will take myself off of you and